Welcome back to the Regal Needle on YouTube. Over the next few videos, we'll be tackling little fixes to extend the life of your garments. Thanks to Miss Elizabeth Tran of Teens Go Green Global for asking for this tutorial. As the founder of Teens Go Green, Elizabeth has been working to make a better environment for over a decade and was Miss Earth Florida and eventually Miss US Earth Eco. Most recently, Elizabeth has held the title of Miss Eco Florida 2018 and made the top 15 at Miss Florida USA 2019 as Miss Miami-Dade County, where she wore an evening gown made completely out of discarded items and packing material. Buttons. Every grandma has a jar or cookie tin of them. One of my favorite things is my jar of buttons that my Nana collected over the years. I've added to it as I've come across buttons or random buttons that never got used for a particular project or spare buttons from a new garment. Vintage buttons are so cool and you're lucky if you inherit them. I save all extra buttons from new garments in my button jar because you never know when you're going to need them. KonMari method notwithstanding. Replacing buttons is fairly painless. The main thing you want to do is make sure you have a nice strong knot and that you sew the button on securely. There are two basic types of button, flat or shankless buttons, and shank buttons, and those are the ones that have the little loop on the back side. I'm a total slacker and have a sewing machine that sews on buttons, and literally, that was the main selling point for me. But it should only take you about 5 minutes to sew on a button securely by hand. My machine can only do 2 or 4 hole buttons and not the ones with a shank, so I do still have to hand sew buttons on occasionally. If your button is a 2-hole or 4-hole button, the technique will be slightly different than if it's a shank button. The whole reason for having a shank on a button is to make sure that it passes through the buttonhole in the garment and has some play when it's buttoned. These are primarily used on jackets, but can also be found on other items as well, especially those made of heavier fabrics. With flat buttons, one of the reasons they come off so easily is because of the stress on the threads because they lack a shank. When replacing them, make sure you leave just a little slack when you're sewing the button on so that once they're fixed they can pass through the buttonhole easily and not pull on the fabric in a weird way. You can make a shank by wrapping the thread between the button and fabric a few times. This technique is really helpful when you have a shankless button on a jacket in particular. Regardless of which type of button you're sewing, take a decent length of thread, about 18 inches or so, and thread your needle. Use a needle threader if necessary, or if you're like me and your arms aren't long enough to see the eye hole of the needle. Pull the thread through and knot the ends. You have to fight the urge to cut a longer length of the thread. Don't ask me why I know this. Understand, this is the magic from beyond the dawn of time, and just go with it. Ignore my advice at your own peril. You should now have about 9 inches of thread. That's enough to sew on a button or 3 without getting your thread tangled or knotted. Take a look at how the other buttons are sewn on the garment. If it's a 2-hole button, there's only one way to do it, but a 4-hole can be either parallel lines or an X across the center. Just make sure you follow the same look as the other buttons on your garment so that your repair doesn't stick out. If it's a shank button, you don't have to worry about this because you won't see any thread at all except on the back side. Once you've determined how your other buttons are affixed, you can match that technique. If your buttons are flat or shankless, you can use a glue stick and slide the button across it gently, then press it onto the correct spot on your fabric to keep it from sliding around and getting off center. I do try to align them with the original marks in the fabric where it was originally sewn, and the glue stick does help with this. Take your threaded needle and from the back of the fabric, poke the needle through one of the existing holes if you can find it, and go up through the button, over the top, go down through the other hole in the button, and into the next hole in the fabric. Repeat this about 5 times. Leave the thread just a tiny bit loose so that the button can easily go through the buttonhole. If the fabric is heavy, create a shank by going through the button but not the fabric on the very last pass over the top. Wrap the thread around the threads between the button and the fabric 3 or 4 times and then go through the fabric to the back side and then secure. To secure the threads, I pass the needle under the loops of thread on the back side of the fabric twice. On the last pass, I wrap the tail of the thread around the sharp part of the needle 3 or 4 times and then pull the needle and thread through to create a knot. You can put a drop of fray check on the knot once you've clipped the threads, if you choose. A button with a shank is similar, but you don't need to leave slack thread since it already has a shank and you won't be creating one. Start us with a flat button and go from the back side of the fabric through to the front, pass the thread through the shank, then back through the fabric 4 or 5 times and finish off as shown for the holy buttons. There you have it. Your garment has a new lease on life and you've saved an item from going into the landfill. If your garment is too worn or stained to bother with repairs, cut off the buttons and stash them in your button jar. You never know when you'll need them. Then you can take your well-used garment to H&M and toss it in their textile recycling bin. They'll give you a coupon for a percentage off buying something in their store. I don't know how much it is or what rules they have for redeeming it, but it does keep that garment hopefully out of a landfill and you'll be well on your way to Granny Button Tin status. If you're new to the channel, thank you for stopping by. Make sure you like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to turn on notifications for when new content drops. Speaking of dropping, drop a comment or photos of your favorite button or button jar down below. Let me know in the comments section what you'd like to learn in the future. Next time we'll be covering hem repairs, both no-sew and sewn. Live long and keep sparkling. I bet you thought it had sewing supplies.